Have you ever wondered if your prayers truly reach God? What if you've been talking to the Creator all wrong? Imagine for a moment a single prayer, powerful enough to transform your life, bringing peace, clarity, and connection. It's not just wishful thinking, it's a promise that Jesus himself revealed. Now, think about your life. What's the one thing you'd change? The heavy weight of anxiety, financial struggles, or a broken relationship? This is your moment to discover how Jesus taught us to pray, not just with words, but with a heart aligned to God's purpose. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast golden field at sunrise, the soft light casting long shadows over the earth. You feel a gentle breeze, the world waking up in perfect harmony. In that moment, you sense something greater, something holy and unshakable. Now picture this. When you approach prayer, do you feel that same sense of awe? Or has it become a rushed habit, a string of hurried words whispered into the void? Jesus invites us to rediscover the sacredness of prayer. In Matthew 6:9, he begins with the words, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." These are not just words, they are a doorway to reverence. Hallowed means sacred, set apart, worthy of our deepest respect. When we say these words, we're not just speaking, we're stepping into holy ground, much like Moses in Exodus 3:5. Do you remember the burning bush? God's voice called out, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." It wasn't the bush that made it holy, it was the presence of God. So how do we make our prayers holy? Begin not with requests, but with worship. Say, "God, you are my creator, my father, my provider. You are holy, greater than anything I can comprehend." Worship isn't about flattery, it's about recognition. It's about putting God in his rightful place in our hearts and minds, above the chaos of our lives. When we start with worship, it transforms the entire act of praying. It shifts the focus from "what do I need" to "who is God?" And in doing so, it prepares our hearts for a deeper connection. It's like tuning an instrument before a concert. Without it, the melody is lost. Think of this. When Moses encountered God, he wasn't given a list of instructions or a solution to all his problems. He was given something much more profound. A moment to acknowledge God's presence. And that moment changed everything. Today, as you pray, take a moment to pause. Begin with worship. Let your heart reflect on who God is, holy, mighty, and faithful. In doing so, you'll find that prayer is no longer a duty, but a privilege, a sacred connection to the Creator of all things. Picture this. You're standing in front of a map, tracing routes, planning the quickest way to your destination. But what if the path you're choosing isn't the right one? What if the journey you've mapped out leads somewhere you never intended to go? That's how many of us approach prayer, like we're the ones holding the map, directing God where to go. Jesus challenges us to think differently. In Matthew 6:10, he says, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." These words shift the focus from our desires to God's perfect plan. They remind us that prayer isn't about bending God's will to match ours, but about aligning ourselves with his greater purpose. Take a moment to consider this. Have you ever prayed for something so fervently, only to realize later it wasn't what you needed? Jesus sets the ultimate example in the Garden of Gethsemane, facing the unimaginable agony of the cross. In Matthew 26:39, he prays, "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done." Even in his darkest hour, Jesus trusted God's plan over his own desires. Surrendering to God's will isn't always easy. It requires trust, a deep, unshakable faith that his plan is better than anything we could imagine. Say, "Lord, I trust you, even when life feels uncertain, even when my plans fall apart. I believe you are working for my good." Think of the countless stories in Scripture where God's will unfolded in ways beyond human understanding. Joseph, sold into slavery, could have cursed his circumstances. But years later, standing as a leader in Egypt, he told his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Trusting God's will doesn't mean life will be free of hardship, but it does mean every challenge serves a purpose in His greater plan. When you pray, let go of the need to control. Instead of saying, "God, here's my plan," try saying, "Lord, guide me. Lead me to where you want me to be." This shift in mindset opens your heart to possibilities you might never have considered. It's like handing the map to someone who knows the terrain far better than you ever could. As you surrender your plans to God, you'll find a sense of peace that no human logic can explain. Trusting in His will doesn't mean giving up. It means stepping into a purpose far greater than your own. So today in your prayers, lay down your desires and say, "Thy will be done." In that act of surrender, you'll discover the freedom of walking in God's perfect plan. Close your eyes and imagine standing in a desert, parched and desperate for water. You see an oasis in the distance, but instead of walking towards it, you start worrying about tomorrow's thirst. Does this sound familiar? That's how many of us live, constantly worrying about what's next, instead of trusting God to meet our needs today. In Matthew 6:11, Jesus teaches us to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." It's a simple yet profound reminder to trust God for what we need in the present moment. But what does it mean to trust Him daily? Think back to the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. In Exodus 16, God provided manna every morning, but only enough for that day. If they tried to gather more, it would spoil. Why? Because God wanted them to learn daily dependence, a trust that didn't stockpile or hoard, but rested in His faithfulness, one day at a time. How often do we let our prayers be consumed by worries about the future? The what-ifs and what-could-bes cloud our minds, distracting us from the provision God has already placed in our hands. Jesus calls us to let go of tomorrow's fears and focus on today's blessings. Say, "Lord, I trust you to provide what I need for today. Help me release my grip on tomorrow's worries and rest in your faithfulness." Daily trust isn't about ignoring the future. It's about shifting our perspective. When we focus on God's provision for today, we remind ourselves that He is faithful, not just now, but always. It's like planting seeds in a garden. You don't dig them up every day to check if they've sprouted. You trust the process, knowing the growth is in God's hands. Think of Jesus feeding the 5,000 in Matthew 14. Before distributing the loaves and fishes, He gave thanks. He didn't wait for the miracle to happen. He thanked God in advance. This act of gratitude reveals the power of trusting God's provision, even when the outcome isn't yet visible. So, how do we apply this to our lives? Begin each day with a simple prayer. "Lord, thank you for what you've already provided. I trust you to meet my needs today, and I will not let tomorrow's fears steal the joy of your blessings right now." When we learn to trust God one day at a time, life's uncertainties lose their power. The desert you thought would overwhelm you becomes a path paved by God's faithfulness. Remember, He is the source of your daily bread, not just for your body, but for your soul. Trust Him today and let tomorrow rest in His hands. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack filled with stones. Each stone represents a grudge, a hurt, or an unresolved conflict. You've carried it for so long that the weight feels normal, but it's slowing you down, stealing your energy and peace. Now imagine setting that backpack down, feeling the weight lifted and walking free. This is what forgiveness does. It frees us. In Matthew 6:12, Jesus teaches us to pray, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." It's a reminder that forgiveness is a two-way street. We ask God for mercy, but we're also called to extend that mercy to others. Yet, how often do we struggle to let go? Think of the parable of the unforgiving servant in Matthew 18:23-35. A servant owed his master an enormous debt, one he could never repay. When the master forgave him, it should have been a life-changing moment. But instead of passing that mercy on, the servant demanded payment from someone who owed him far less. The master's anger was swift. "Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had on you?" This parable isn't just a story. It's a mirror. How often do we cling to resentment, even while asking God to forgive us? Forgiveness isn't about excusing someone's actions or pretending the hurt didn't happen. It's about releasing the burden of bitterness and making room for God's grace to heal us. When you pray, take a moment to examine your heart. Is there someone you need to forgive? Say, "Lord, I release this person to you. Heal my heart and teach me to walk in your grace." Forgiveness is not a feeling. It's a choice, a decision to trust God with the pain and let him handle the justice. Jesus reminds us in Matthew 6:14-15 that forgiveness is essential for our own healing. If you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. This isn't a threat, it's a spiritual principle. Holding on to unforgiveness blocks the flow of God's mercy in our lives. Consider the story of Joseph in Genesis. Betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, he had every reason to hold a grudge. Yet, when he faced them years later, he chose forgiveness. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." His choice to forgive not only restored his family, but also freed him to step into the fullness of God's plan for his life. Forgiveness is powerful. It's not about letting others off the hook. It's about setting yourself free. When you let go of the stones in your backpack, you make room for God's peace to fill your life. Today, ask yourself, what weight am I carrying that I need to release? Pray, "Lord, I choose forgiveness. Help me let go of this burden and walk in your freedom." The path to forgiveness isn't easy, but it's worth it. Each step brings healing, restoration, and a closer connection to God. And as you forgive, you'll find that the weight you've been carrying was never yours to bear. Let it go and walk in the freedom God desires for you. Picture yourself standing at a crossroads, faced with a choice. One path is smooth and inviting but leads to trouble, while the other is rocky and uncertain but keeps you safe. You hesitate, unsure which way to go. In moments like these, temptation whispers, urging you to take the easier route, even if it pulls you away from God's purpose. Jesus understood the power of temptation and the struggle it brings. That's why, in Matthew 6:13, he teaches us to pray, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." This isn't just a request for protection, it's a plea for guidance, a recognition that we can't face life's challenges on our own. Temptation comes in many forms: the urge to give up, the pull of anger, the lure of selfish desires. It's different for everyone, but the danger is the same. It can lead us away from God's path. Think of Joseph in Genesis 39, faced with temptation from Potiphar's wife. He didn't try to handle it on his own. Instead, he fled, trusting God to protect and guide him. His faith kept him from falling into sin and preserved his integrity. When you pray, ask God to guide your steps and strengthen your resolve. Say, "Lord, I'm not strong enough on my own. Lead me away from temptation and protect me from anything that could harm my faith." This isn't an admission of weakness, it's an acknowledgement of God's strength. Temptation is a battle we all face, but the good news is, we're not alone in the fight. In Ephesians 6:16, Paul reminds us to take up the shield of faith, which can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Prayer is that shield, a barrier between us and the forces that try to pull us away from God. Jesus himself faced temptation in the wilderness. In Matthew 4, Satan tempted him with power, comfort, and shortcuts to glory. But Jesus didn't rely on his own strength. he relied on God's word, declaring, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." His victory over temptation wasn't just for himself, it was a model for us. Life's battles are too big to fight alone, and God doesn't expect us to. When you pray, remember that He is your protector, your guide, and your strength. Say, "Lord, help me to stay on the path you've set for me. When I'm faced with choices, give me wisdom to choose what honors you. Deliver me from anything that could harm my soul." Temptation will come, it's inevitable. But with God's guidance and protection, you can overcome it. Each time you choose His path over your own, you grow stronger, closer to Him, and more aligned with His purpose. So when you face those crossroads, don't rely on your own strength. Turn to God and let Him lead you to safety and victory. Imagine finding a quiet corner in a bustling city, where the noise of traffic fades and the chaos of the world feels distant. In that peaceful space, you can hear yourself think, feel your heart steady, and sense the presence of something greater. That's what prayer is meant to be, a personal, intimate connection with God, free from distractions and the need to perform. In Matthew 6:6, Jesus tells us, "When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." This is a profound invitation to step away from the spotlight and enter a sacred space where it's just you and God. Too often, we're tempted to make prayer a public display, worrying about how we sound or whether others will be impressed. But Jesus reminds us that true prayer isn't about being seen or heard by others. It's about being real with God. Think of Daniel in Daniel 6:10. Even when praying to God was illegal, Daniel went to his room, opened his windows toward Jerusalem, and prayed 3 times a day. He wasn't trying to draw attention, he was simply honoring his relationship with God. When you pray, find your quiet space, a place where the world fades away and your focus can be fully on Him. It doesn't have to be a literal room. It could be a park bench, a corner of your home, or even a moment of stillness during a walk. Say, "Lord, I'm here. I want to spend this time with you. Speak to my heart and guide me in your ways." This kind of prayer isn't about length or eloquence. It's about sincerity. It's about coming to God as you are, with no masks or pretenses. Think of Hannah in 1 Samuel 1:10-13, pouring out her heart to God in silent desperation. Her prayer wasn't polished or performative, but it was honest, and God heard her. In our world of constant noise and distractions, finding that quiet space for prayer can feel like a luxury, but it's not just important, it's essential. When you step away from the chaos and spend time with God in secret, you'll find clarity, peace, and a deeper connection that transforms your heart. So the next time you pray, resist the urge to focus on how it looks or sounds. Instead, focus on who you're speaking to. Say, "Lord, thank you for this moment with you. I don't have perfect words, but I trust you hear my heart." In those quiet, unseen moments, God meets you. He sees your sincerity, hears your prayers, and works in ways you can't yet imagine. Prayer isn't about impressing others. It's about connecting with the one who knows you better than anyone. Step into that quiet space and let it become your sanctuary of peace, strength, and transformation. Close your eyes and picture the stars above, vast and unreachable, yet steady in their place. Now imagine your prayers as a whisper carried to the heavens, reaching the creator of those stars. Do you ever wonder if your words make it that far? Or do doubts creep in, making you question if anyone is really listening? Jesus addresses this fear directly in Matthew 21:22. Whatever you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive. Faith, he tells us, is the bridge between our prayers and God's power. Without it, our words may feel like they're lost in the wind. But with faith, they become unstoppable. Think of the woman with the issue of blood in Matthew 9:20-22. For 12 long years she suffered, isolated and desperate. But when she heard Jesus was near, her faith stirred her to act. She thought, if I just touch his garment, I will be healed. Her faith wasn't about grand gestures or elaborate words. It was simple, raw, and powerful. And it moved Jesus to say, your faith has made you whole. When you pray, let your faith guide you. Say, Lord, I trust that you hear me. Even when I can't see the answers yet, I believe you are at work in my life. Faith isn't about seeing results immediately. It's about trusting that God is already moving, even in the unseen. Doubt often tries to creep into our prayers, whispering lies like, what if God isn't listening? Or what if my prayer doesn't matter? But Jesus encourages us to stand firm. He shows us that faith is not just belief, it's confidence. Confidence that God hears every word, sees every tear, and holds every hope in his hands. Consider Abraham in Genesis. God promised him a child, but years passed without fulfillment. Abraham could have doubted, could have given up. Instead, he chose faith, believing in the impossible because he trusted in the one who made the promise. And God's timing, though long in coming, was perfect. When you pray, approach God with that same trust. Speak boldly, even if your voice trembles. Say, Lord, I know you are faithful. I believe your promises are true, and I trust that you are working all things for my good. Faith transforms your prayers from mere words into a declaration of trust in God's power. Remember, prayer is not about the size of your need, but the size of your faith. It's not about how much you say, but how much you trust. Even a mustard seed of faith, Jesus tells us, can move mountains. So the next time doubt tries to steal your hope, let faith remind you of who you're praying to, the Creator of the stars, the one who calls you his child, the God who moves heaven and earth for you. Pray with faith and watch as your prayers reach far beyond the stars, touching the heart of the one who loves you more than you can imagine. Prayer is more than words. It's a conversation with the Creator. It's a way to align your heart with his, to seek wisdom, surrender control, and trust his timing. When you pray as Jesus taught, you invite transformation into your life. So take a moment now. Say, Lord, I trust you. I surrender my plans, my worries, and my fears to you. Guide me, protect me, and fill me with your peace. Remember, he's always listening, always present, and always ready to move in your life.